Today, there has been a significant development in the ongoing conflict in the Kyiv region. After a brief pause due to unfavorable weather conditions for combat, the Ukrainians have resumed their series of attacks. The most intense clashes have occurred in the vicinity of Lobkov in the past few days. Additionally, Ukrainian forces have recently carried out a number of light reconnaissance operations around Zheribzhanki. Based on their actions today, it appears that the primary objective of these reconnaissance attacks was to identify Russian firing positions in Zheribzhan and determine how to secure their flanks against potential counterattacks from this village. Earlier this morning, the Ukrainians finally launched their initial assault towards Peterhartki. If we refer to the topographic map, we can observe that Peterhartki is situated in a low-lying area, making it a logical target for the Ukrainian forces. According to Russian sources, the Ukrainians deployed 5 armored fighting vehicles and 2 tanks during this operation. Furthermore, the Russians have reported that the Ukrainians have begun implementing a new tactic which has proven to be much more effective along the separation front. The Ukrainians have adopted a highly effective tactic by swiftly deploying their assault units directly to the contact line using various armored carriers. These carriers provide immediate support while a few tanks engage in long-range fire to assist the ground forces. Additionally, skilled operators like John help navigate the situation on the ground. This new approach has proven more successful than heavy direct assaults due to the Russian strategy of creating multiple small defensive positions instead of a single large fortification. This necessitates the high mobility of small assault units for maximum attack efficiency. After engaging in continuous combat for an hour, the Ukrainians reportedly managed to completely drive the Russians out of the forest, which is arguably one of the most crucial positions in the region. The forest, stretching 1 kilometer in length and 300 meters in width, facilitated a remarkably swift assault. It provides significant tactical advantages, allowing Ukrainian forces to conceal and assemble their assault units right at the doorstep of 2 Russian-controlled settlements. Furthermore, it serves as a protective barrier for Ukrainian flanks against unexpected counterattacks. After their initial success, Ukrainian forces began preparing reinforcements to further capitalize on their gains. Shortly thereafter, the Ukrainians were ready to launch the next series of attacks. One small assault unit advanced from the northern bank of the river and initiated a fierce firefight against Russian positions, effectively hampering their mobility. Simultaneously, a second assault unit launched an attack on the settlement from the southern bank, specifically from the forest. Following approximately an hour of intense clashes, the Ukrainians successfully pushed the Russians out of the western part of the settlement. Russian sources reported that their forces encountered significant challenges in repelling the Ukrainian assault. This was primarily due to the Ukrainian strategic use of remote anti-armor mine shells to effectively mine the roads leading to the Russian reserves. Consequently, even when the Russian reserves finally arrived, they lacked sufficient forces to deliver a decisive blow, resulting in a stalemate between the two sides. Both parties heavily relied on artillery support throughout the engagement. However, Russian sources did not provide further details on the role of the Russian artillery. According to sources, the Ukrainians prioritized counter-battery fire rather than providing direct support to their ground units. In response, the Russians were compelled to reciprocate, resulting in 2 separate battles taking place simultaneously, one between infantry forces and another between artillery batteries, aiming to change the situation. The Russian forces requested airstrikes on Ukrainian positions soon after Russian assault helicopters. Scott, 52, arrived at the scene and began targeting the Ukrainians with missiles. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that they successfully shot down one of the helicopters during the engagement. Eventually, it appears that the Ukrainians had to retreat back to the forest, failing to establish complete control over the settlement at that time. Nevertheless, even prominent Russian sources acknowledge that the Ukrainians came very close to capturing the village. This is why they anticipate a new attack on Peterhartki in the near future, which is expected to be even more challenging to repel. The Ukrainians now have a better understanding of the terrain and will likely avoid making previous mistakes. The next logical step for them is Rybinsky, where the local geography will demand greater coordination among multiple offensive units and exceptional tactics to counter the Ukrainian invasion. The highly anticipated counteroffensive planned by Ukraine is rapidly approaching, causing increased tension along the defensive line in the south of the country. Over the past week, there have been violent demonstrations and attacks in several Russian-controlled cities such as Kherson, Melitopol, and Berdyansk. These cities, situated in the south, lie on the route that Russians take to travel from the mainland to Crimea. Ukraine regularly targets this road to disrupt the land connection between Crimea and Russia, making it susceptible to airstrikes. Additionally, cities along the Russian Federation's western and southern border, such as Bryansk, Belgorod, Rostov, and Krasnodar, have been vulnerable to attacks. Russia's options for responding to these assaults are significantly limited. The primary objective of these ongoing attacks is the liberation of all occupied Ukrainian regions, with a particular focus on Crimea. Attacks on critical supply routes, especially in the past few days, have prompted Moscow to raise its alert level in the surrounding region of the Russian-occupied territory. People in the Zaporizhia Oblast witnessed at least 6 explosions reported the previous day. This area serves as a crucial railway hub for Russian forces in southern Ukraine and plays a vital role in connecting occupied Crimea. Ivan Fedorov, the former mayor of Melitopol who has fled the city, claims that 5 explosions were heard in the city, resulting in heavy smoke production to the north in Melitopol. There have been reports of at least 1 explosion occurring on a railway in the Dalnygorsk neighborhood close to Melitopol itself. This railway has been used by Russian forces since February 2022 to transfer military equipment and personnel from Krasnodar to Donbass and Mariupol via the bridge on the Crimea line. Melitopol, with a population of approximately 150,000 people, has been under Russian military occupation. The recent strikes have targeted an important logistics and supply hub that provides resources to Russian forces. Furthermore, an assault from a considerable distance hit the Russian-held port city of Berdyansk, located on the Sea of Azov. This attack showcases Ukraine's capability to target Russian objectives located far from the front lines. Berdyansk, situated approximately 96 kilometers away from the front lines, has now become a long-range target that Ukraine can effectively hit thanks to donated weapons. This marks at least the 4th assault on the port city in the past few weeks. Following this most recent incident, an official stationed in Russia stated that the attack was carried out using cruise missiles supplied by the United Kingdom and launched from Storm Shadow aircraft. According to the Berdyansk City Military Administration Telegram channel in Ukraine, as a result of the strike, a significant portion of the Russian naval vessels docked at the port sailed away from the coast. During the early stages of the conflict, the Russians achieved a significant victory by seizing control of Berdyansk. This strategic move allowed them to capture around a dozen ships from the Ukrainian Navy and gain control over an important logistical and supply center that provides resources to Russian soldiers in the region. The primary objective of the Ukrainian armed forces' assault on rails and ports is to disrupt Russia's supply lines and sever the connection between Crimea and southern Ukraine. This involves cutting off Russia's access to ports and trains, hindering their ability to sustain their presence in Crimea. The exact focus of Ukraine's upcoming counteroffensive is not yet known. However, a successful attack on the southern districts of Kherson and Zaporizhia could potentially open a path towards the Crimean Peninsula and sever the Russian supply line to the region. Consequently, Crimea is considered the most crucial territory in the area, and the head of Kiev has consistently emphasized the strong determination to regain control over the region. The decisions made by the Ukrainian government have given President Zelensky's insistence on reclaiming Crimea renewed significance. A closer examination of Ukraine's strategy reveals their plan to regain control of Crimea from Vladimir Putin. Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, Oleksiy Danilov, announced the plan, which is scheduled for a counterattack in the upcoming spring season. The strategy involves a comprehensive approach, including the demolition of certain infrastructure and the implementation of targeted military operations. A significant feature in the region is the colossal 19-kilometer bridge connecting Crimea and Russia, recognized as Europe's longest bridge. Crimea, situated between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, currently houses tens of thousands of stationed Russian soldiers and multiple military installations operated by Russian officials. Officials from the White House have consistently emphasized that their stance regarding Crimea remains unchanged, asserting that Crimea is an integral part of Ukraine. However, By discussing means to neutralize Crimea, the United States has inched closer to crossing Putin's red line. The question arises, how can the United States exert more pressure on Vladimir Putin? Let's delve into the details. The United States holds the belief that Crimea could be regained by Ukraine without resorting to bloodshed. Diplomats and senior officials are engaging in discussions regarding the possibility of imposing an embargo on Russia to deter its aggressive behavior. There is a strong likelihood that both nations may escalate strikes against each other in the near future. According to the former U.S. diplomat's perspective, the Ukrainian effort to regain control of Crimea would be better served by preventing a Russian assault on the territory through the implementation of a blockade. This viewpoint is shared by others, as there has been an increase in support for Ukraine's embargo on Crimea. Ben Hodges, the former commander of the United States Army in Europe, has advised the Ukrainian armed forces to consider cutting off supply routes to Crimea. Such measures could further weaken Russia's grip on the region and potentially create leverage for Ukraine in reclaiming control over Crimea. Hodges provided instructions for the Ukrainian armed forces to conduct daily precision strikes from Sevastopol, utilizing long-range capabilities. In the past day, the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed two Russian main military bases in Melitopol. The fact that the two violent explosions in the city could be so effective were the estimations of opening a corridor to the Crimea, as we mentioned. Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorev shared the first warm statement about the situation after two violent explosions in the city. According to Fedorov, the explosions in Melitopol resulted in the death of hundreds of Russian soldiers. The situation in the city is still said to be critical, and the fires caused by the explosions reportedly damaged these two Russian military bases as well. Melitopol stands at a very strategic point on the way to liberate Crimea. The Russian main headquarters blown up by the Ukrainian armed forces were located on a very important transfer route between Mariupol and Crimea. In this context, this operation was strategically a very important move to cut the connection between the Crimea and the Russian army in Ukraine. With this critical attack in Melitopol, did the Ukrainian armed forces continue to pursue their plans to retake Crimea? Since the beginning of the war? Yes, maybe it's too early to tell, but if you are aware, it is important that the recent drone attacks on Crimea, the targeting of a city like Armyansk, which can connect with Crimea in terms of land border by Ukraine. These attacks constantly bring before us a reality that we cannot realize at the moment. Ukraine very much wants to take back Crimea and is trying to complete the Melitopol phase for this to happen. Also, for a long time the attacks by the Ukrainian forces had not caused such a loss to the Russians. The fact that hundreds of Russian soldiers were neutralized in Melitopol with a single attack of the Ukrainian forces is actually a very serious situation. But the exact figures would be stated completely and accurately in the coming days. At the moment it's said that the casualties are very high. Of course, after these striking attacks, discussions also flared up about Melitopol connection with the Crimean plan and whether the Ukrainian forces would continue their attacks on the recapture of the peninsula. According to the city's exiled mayor, what is happening in the southern city of Melitopol is touted as the gateway to the Crimean peninsula. On the other hand, it is not only the soldiers of the Ukrainian army who are making efforts to liberate the peninsula. Again, we must also recognize what the Ukrainian partisans are doing in this regard. Ukrainian partisans who work day and night for the freedom of their country and to get out of this war with the least damage took very serious steps, especially in Melitopol, the front line that divides the Zaporizhia region in two. In recent days, it is said that Ukrainian partisan groups have provided intelligence data to the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as some operational breakthroughs, and even Russian troops cannot move very easily. Not only in Melitopol, but also in the south of Ukraine, because Ukrainian partisans share the strategic positions of the Russian troops on the southern front lines, including Melitopol. The location of ammunition depots and the route followed by the Russian army in the south of Ukraine with the Ukrainian armed forces. In this way, the Ukrainian forces can destroy the important military resources of the Russians with pinpoint operations. But given the advances in Melitopol and clashes in southern Ukraine, is there sufficient ground for the Ukrainian forces to retake Crimea now? The dominance of the Ukrainians in Kherson and the violent clashes in the Dnipro archipelago even now in a way set the cornerstones of this backdrop for the Ukrainian armed forces, because the Ukrainian army continues to attack from almost every direction to take back the Crimean Peninsula. Let's take a quick look at the latest situation in the Dnipro Islands region. Currently, Ukrainian forces are making serious efforts to move on to the next phase of their major Crimean offensive plan. You may remember that the Ukrainian army established a river navy that would be active in the southern directions of the Dnipro. This navy needed a flagship. This need was met by the Ukrainians with a war beast called Buka. Currently, the boat is allegedly in the cool waters of the Dnipro towards Kiev. This has even proven by some photographs after photos of Bucha in the Dnipro River were shared. The Russians once again realized how serious the Ukrainian forces' plans to operate in the south were. So were these striking plans of the Ukrainians limited to Bucha? Of course not. The fire that started in Dnipro finally reached the Crimea. If you remember recently, Ukrainian forces targeted the Crimean city of Bakhchisarai. The cities of Yalta and Gurzów were also affected by the striking Ukrainian airstrikes. After the attacks, the sirens of the air defense systems were heard again in the Crimean Peninsula. It was precisely at this point that the Ukrainian forces succeeded in preparing a very effective ground for recapturing the Crimea. Currently, the Crimean Peninsula, which was constantly targeted by Ukrainian drones, was currently in the attack range of the Ukrainians because the Ukrainian army could target this peninsula, both with its drones and with its long-range missiles, especially in this critical time period. The fact that the Ukrainians were so close to the goal of Crimea increased the probability of the peninsula to return to its original owner. You know that before the recent attacks that affected the cities of Bakhchisarai, Yalta and Gurzów, the Ukrainian forces were constantly conducting drone strikes on the peninsula to detect the strategic positions of the Russian air defense systems on the Crimean Peninsula. The use of cost-effective drones for this purpose and the fact that there was not much expectation from the attacks highlighted the ingenious war strategy of the Ukrainians. And the most important detail on this issue was that the Ukrainians had achieved their goal because the Ukrainian armed forces used cheap unmanned aerial vehicles such as the Mugen 5 to explore the location of the Russian air defense systems in Crimea in the past weeks. These drone attacks carried out in the early hours of the morning once again brought the tension in Crimea to its peak. These attacks took place around 6 a.m. Ukrainian forces firstly sent 5 Mugen UAVs to Crimea. All of these UAVs were destroyed by Russian air defense systems on the peninsula about 1 hour after this attack. 5 Mugen-type UAVs appeared again in the skies of Crimea. According to some sources, some of these 5 UAVs damaged Russian military resources in the peninsula. However, according to the Russian media, the attack carried out by the Ukrainian forces with a total of 10 Mugen 5 UAVs was not successful, but the Russians were missing a very important detail. As you can see, the Ukrainian armed forces can carry out airstrikes on the Crimean Peninsula at any time. And some of these attacks can create serious risk factors for the Russian troops on the peninsula. In addition, the residents of the Crimea region and the families, relatives of the Russian soldiers on the peninsula are also disturbed by this situation. This is why every day there is an influx of people from the peninsula. The peninsula, piers, are home to thousands of Russians who, especially in the last days, want to escape from Crimea and do not want to experience the effects of the war anymore. Unlike people who do not want to live in Crimea because of Russia's war strategies, Ukraine prioritizes the idea of "I want to live." The reason why the air defense systems were activated was that the unmanned aerial vehicles of Ukraine were seen in the skies of Crimea. Ukrainian forces attacked to hit the Saki airbase. However, the president claimed that a Ukrainian attack aircraft equipped with the Iridium system was shot down. Photos allegedly belonging to the downed Ukrainian attack aircraft were shared on the Telegram messaging application. In addition to the extraordinary design of the unmanned aerial vehicle seen in the photo, it turned out that the American company Garmin was equipped with the Iridium system, a global positioning system. According to experts, this is how the Ukrainian military tried to circumvent the operation of electronic warfare equipment. It was not specified how strong the cargo carried by the Ukrainian drone was, but such attacks on the peninsula show that the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to circumvent the protection of Crimea. Ukraine's insistence on Crimea is reinforced by the attacks it organizes as it is known. There have been repeated explosions in the peninsula in the last week. The most striking of the attacks that took place last week occurred in the airbase area in Gvardeysk. The mysterious Ukrainian weapon had struck and blew up the military airbase 240 kilometers from Russia's front line in Crimea. Local people reported that explosions were heard and seen again in the temporarily occupied Crimea, this time in the area of the military airbase in the urban-type village of Gvardeysk in Simferopol district. In short, as can be seen from the attacks, Ukraine is determined to take back Crimea. Will this relentless war that started in February 2022 end with the recapture of Crimea? It's still too early to tell, but the whole struggle of the Kiev leader and the Ukrainian forces is in this direction. On the other hand, Ukraine's determined stance makes Russia very uneasy. The allegations that Russia is trying to forcibly evacuate Crimea clearly demonstrates the Kremlin's concern. According to some sources, Russian officials visited the houses in Crimea and asked whether the inhabitants of the households were children or elderly. The collection of this information indicates that Russian forces are likely preparing for a possible so-called forced evacuation. We also learned that the Russian army has strengthened the defense of Crimea amid the news that Ukraine is starting to warm up to retake Crimea. Vadim Skibitsky, representative of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, claimed that the military intelligence in the region showed that the forces on the peninsula were constantly ready for war, and that in some sectors, Russian forces were seen evacuating. Skibitsky said that the main intelligence directorate is constantly monitoring everything related to the activities of the military group in the temporarily occupied Crimea. Indeed, they are preparing for defensive actions on the territory of the peninsula. Also released satellite images show that Russian forces have increased the number of barriers and trenches along roads leading to occupied Crimea in Kherson Oblast over the past few months. Sergei Aksionov, the head of the Russian-controlled authorities in Crimea, said Kiev forces would not retake the peninsula under any circumstances. Aksionov cited the defensive measures taken at the behest of Russian President Vladimir Putin as the reason for this. And he said Moscow is reinforcing parts of the southern Zaporizhia region that Ukraine has annexed. As the Crimean tensions between Ukraine and Russia escalated, Vladimir Putin visited Crimea to commemorate the anniversary of the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin made a surprise visit to occupied Crimea to mark the 9th anniversary of Russia's illegal annexation of the peninsula, just one day after an international court issued an arrest warrant for him. Russian state media reported. Local officials said Mr. Putin was scheduled to attend the ceremonies in Crimea via video link, but instead traveled to the Black Sea port city of Sevastopol. State media published footage of Putin wearing a cardigan while visiting a boys' art school and talking to Sevastopol Governor Mikhail Vosiv. On such a historic day, the president is always with the people of Sevastopol and Sevastopol, Rose Vosiv wrote in the Telegram messaging app. The visit signaled the Kremlin's determination to continue its business as usual. 24 hours after the International Criminal Court charged Mr. Putin with war crimes and issued a warrant for his arrest, Russian officials dismissed the court's statements as meaningless and promised not to cooperate. Footage of Mr. Putin roaming freely in the Crimea, whose recapture by Russian troops in 2014 heralded his full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February, and his decision to visit a school showed how unlikely the arrest warrant would change his behavior. Also, Vladimir Putin showed no intention of giving up on the Kremlin's gains. Instead, he stressed the importance of retaining Crimea, referring to Crimea's largest city. Putin said that obviously security issues are now top priority for Crimea and Sevastopol. We will do everything necessary to fend off threats. The Russian leader promised to continue his struggle for Crimea with all his might. But we know that the situation on the Kiev front is no different. Zelensky repeats at every opportunity that this war started with Crimea and will end with Crimea. Tensions between the two are rising day by day. The events in the coming days will enable us to make a clearer comment on the Crimea. We will wait and see if Crimea can change the course of the Ukrainian war. Ultimately, liberating Crimea means making the peninsula untenable for the Russian army, navy, and air force. A large-scale offensive accompanied by precision strikes and shelling against Russian air, ground, and naval forces could help drive Putin's men out of Crimea. This concerted attack on the peninsula would be a major blow to Russia's morale to isolate and neutralize it and seriously damage its military infrastructure with long-range attacks in the absence of a decisive war success elsewhere. The liberation of Crimea would mean in disguise defeat for Moscow and could lead to the collapse of Russian forces on the ground and even the downfall of Putin. In addition, Kiev can isolate the only terrestrial communication line connecting Crimea to Russia using long-range precision strikes. The Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to Russia over Mariupol and Melitopol along the Sea of Azov coastline is very important in the land communication line. Targeting this transport infrastructure will initiate the isolation of Crimea from supplier movement. Let us remind you that the Kerch Bridge was severely damaged months ago. A large Ukrainian armored force attacking southeast in the direction of the Sea of Azov and penetrating the Russian linear defenses will complete the isolation of Crimea and enable the closer deployment of HIMARS rocket launchers, which will then be within range of key Russian installations in Crimea. If Ukraine wants Crimea, it must make the Saki air base on the west coast of Crimea completely unusable. The logistics center in Zhinoy in the north of Crimea should turn into a huge bonfire once Crimea becomes untenable. Ukrainian ground forces may begin to attack south, the Perekop Isthmus, and then the wider Crimea. It remains unclear whether Ukraine will use the above-mentioned strategies, but the Ukraine war will continue with all its violence, and even the heat of the conflicts on the front lines will warm the agenda in the spring. At the other end of this line of fire, there will always be Crimea. Thanks for watching us.